Okay, so this is Gerald Alpin from the Office of Surveillance and Epidemiology. The options are actually limited. One thing you heard over the last 2 days is that heart attacks, myocardial infarctions, are actually quite common amongst persons with diabetes. Somewhere around 2 to 4% of diabetics will have a heart attack per year. That high background rate, it may sound like a low number, 2 to 4%, it's actually quite high, makes spontaneous reporting through the MedWatch program or other such surveillance systems really unsuitable for the kind of inferences we want to make about the cardiovascular risk of a drug. So that type of approach, looking at data from our adverse event reporting system, really wouldn't be feasible here, because you get individual case histories, and all these patients have diabetes. That's why they're on these drugs. Many of them have coexistent high blood pressure, high lipids. You really can't make any inference about the drug. So that's sort of pharmacovigilance there. Other approaches would be to look into administrative databases, like one of the advisory committee members mentioned, although the committee didn't really pick up on that, to do what would be called a pharmacoepidemiological study. These studies are also not without problems. One of the issues, just like in clinical trials, is validating the outcome or the event of interest. And just as it's important in a prospective clinical trial, it's also important to validate these events in an administrative database or other such type of epidemiologic study. Doesn't mean it can't be done, it's just difficult. Those studies are also better for confirming associations than for ruling out associations. We're currently in the process under PDUFA 4 of working on a set of best practices, on a guidance document for best practices for observational pharmacoepidemiologic studies using administrative databases for safety questions. We held a public meeting on that, I believe it was about 2 months ago in early May, and we're starting to get work on that now. Those are pretty much the options we have. So while some of these pharmacoepidemiologic studies may be useful, I still think that the clinical trial approach is the best approach here from a methodologic point of view.
Thank you. I'm going to see if we have any questions from the phone. Grace, do we have any questions from the phone?
If you would like to respond, please press star 1. 1 moment, please. Matthew Herper of Forbes, you may ask your question.
I just was hoping for 2 things. A little more, do you have a sense of whether you thought the panel was, how much leeway the FDA has in designing what this kind of screening study idea would be in terms of, I know you mentioned it might be a single study, it might be several studies, it might be an interim look at a larger study. I was hoping you could talk a little bit about how much range you see in the tone of the advice. And also, is this an approach, this screening approach, something that could be applied to other areas where there are safety or efficacy controversies with regard to surrogate endpoints?
This is Bob Temple. I think the committee at one point or another thought all of those were possibilities. The first, 1,000 patients in a larger trial later is possible. Some people thought very much there ought to be a single long-term study designed early to rule out very large risks, and others thought that current practices could be modified enough to give you useful data. I think this is going to take some more thought on our part, but I think they were all considered reasonably possible.
And this is John Jenkins. To add to that, we clearly need to go back and think internally about the advice we heard. I think we clearly heard feedback from the committee that they thought we should have more well-designed studies to address cardiovascular risk before approval, and the ability to more clearly understand the potential for risk in the pre-approval database. If you think about it, really what they recommended today is just an extension of what we already do with every application with regard to safety. We have to look at what we know from the safety database and whether we think the safety database is adequate to rule out an unacceptable risk given the benefits of the drug and the available therapies. I think what we heard is that the committee recommended that we have more information in the future to better understand the cardiovascular risk and to rule out an unacceptably high risk before approval. So it's an extension of the usual paradigm we apply to these decisions. And it is possible that the approach could be applied in other settings. Dr. Temple earlier mentioned the non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs, where it's very common now because of the history of those drugs and the questions have been raised that they come for approval already having conducted very large studies. Whether this model of a screening approach could apply there, we would have to go back and consider, but it's not inconceivable that the model could apply there. But we really need to go back and think about it in more detail. And as Dr. Berman said earlier, it's probably going to be to some degree variable depending upon the individual agent in question. We heard the committee discuss today, depending upon the benefit that the new agent might be demonstrating, that may have an impact on how certain you need to be about ruling out unacceptable risk before approval versus after approval. And again, that's an extension of our usual paradigm. We're much more willing to accept higher levels of risk, known or unknown, for drugs that have significant benefits over existing therapy.
Thank you. Do we have any more questions on the phone, please?
Once again, to respond, please press star 1.
Grace, if we don't have questions on the phone, I'll move back to the room. Do we have other questions? Donna Young?
I just have a clarification on as far as like how the screening study would work with and the pre-approval study. Would it be the cardiovascular study? Would it be a completely separate study or an extension of an ongoing phase 3 study?
You're looking at me. This is John Jenkins. I'll start answering. I think we heard differing suggestions from the panel. Dr. Fleming spoke the most about the concept of the screening study. He did not rule out the possibility that the screening study he was describing could be an integration and a continuation of a phase 3 trial to demonstrate efficacy. But I think we heard that different models could be used. We heard that you could have a prospective plan where all of your phase 3 trials would be done in a way where they could be pooled together at the end to get a cardiovascular risk assessment. We heard ideas of a standalone cardiovascular safety trial, and we heard hybrids of those where some of the phase 3 trials could be extended longer term. I even asked a question about, in this era where everyone wants to look at adaptive trial designs, whether your phase 3 trial could be looked at for an efficacy analysis at, say, 6 or 12 months, but then continued on in a long-term fashion, in a controlled fashion, so that you could do the screening assessment for safety at some point and maybe a final confirmatory assessment for safety at a later point. I think those are all possibilities. And I think it's going to depend to some degree upon the sponsor and their desired approach and our assessment of whether it meets our needs to give us the data that was recommended. Mary, did I cover anything or miss anything that you'd like to add to?
Do we have another question in the room? Do we have any more questions on the phone, Grace?
No phone questions, ma'am.
If we have no further questions, we will end this telecon. Thank you all for joining us today.